Welcome to the fastest stop in town. Today we're going to start this Yevamot Daf Gimel. We are going to begin on Beis Amid Beis. Yesterday, when we began the Masechta, we only saw the Mishnah, so we're up to the words of the Gemara Michti. Let us see. Now, Kulhu, all of these arayos that we mentioned in our Mishnah, all 15 of them, mi'achos isha yalfinon. They were all derived from the din of achos isha, namely your wife's sister. That just like, as Rashi says, Masha Paturos min Yibum, all the dinim of all these 15 arayos in which you do not do Yibum with her. Also, if the man who died, she also had a co-wife, so you do not do Yibum with a co-wife either. This is all derived from Achos Isha. We're going to see that later on. How do we know that? So if that's the case, so listening Achos Isha Bereisha. If in fact Achos Isha, as we're going to see, is the primary source to all the other arayos, it would make sense that that one should be put first. And it's not. The V'chi Tana Chumrei Nakat. Maybe the Tana is putting the stringencies, Rav Shimon the Omer Sreifa Chamura. According to Rav Shimon, we know that he holds that Sreifa is the most severe of the Arba Misos based in. So therefore, perhaps that is the reason why he's put there. It says Rashi. It says in Masechta Sanhedrin, the Sreifa Chamura Lohachi Tana Reisha Bito. When it comes to having tashmish with one's daughter, Ubas Bito, granddaughter, Kul Ad Aim Chama B'Sreifa. All of them up until where it says Aim Chamav, the din is B'Sreifa. So it makes sense to put Bito first, even though we don't learn out from Bito. That's not the primary source, but we want to mention that first because it's the most Chamer. So Yihachi Lisni Chamosa Bereisha. Then we should also mention Chamoso, the din of the mother-in-law, the Iker Sreifa B'Chamosa Ksiva, because the din of having tashmish with one's wife's mother, with one's mother-in-law, that also is Isser Sreifa, and it's actually written down, says Rashi, Isha Sheyikachas Isha Ves Amah Zima Hi B'Eshis Srefu. It says beferish that if you would marry a woman and also take her mother, which is your mother-in-law, that's Chamoso, it says beferish B'Eshis Srefu. So if the whole reason is because we want to teach the most Chomer Einish, which is Sreifa, then it would make sense you should put Chamosa first, because not only is it Sreifa, but also the pasuk support to support that. But furthermore, Basar Chamoso listening Kalato. After the mother-in-law, it makes sense that what should be mentioned is the daughter-in-law. The Basar Sreifa Skila Chamura, because after Sreifa you have Skila. Says Rashi, V'chol Shar Rayos Demastisin in B'misas Beistin El Bekares. The other ones that are mentioned are kares, are not misas bastin. So therefore, it would make sense that kalasoi should be placed in this case. But if you look at the very, very top of this Amud, when it lists all of them, it ends v'eshes achiv shul hayabolamo, but kalaso. Kalaso, the daughter-in-law, is mamish, the last one mentioned. Now, it would make more sense that it should be right next to chamoso, especially that the din of having tashmish with one's daughter-in-law or with one's son's wife. So the din is that there's a chiyuv skila. Sreiv is more chamer according to Shittas Rav Shimon. So then, fine. So first mention chamosa, then mention afterwards you should mention kalasai. So Ella, the reason why Bito is first cannot have anything to do with what's more chamer, because then it's hard to understand why Chamoso and Chalaso is placed where they are. So he says the reason why Bito is first, even though it's not the primary source, rather it's Achos Isha, Kiban de Asim Midrasha Chaviv. Since Bito comes from a drasha, as we're going to see, it's Chaviv. And as we saw in Rashi on yesterday's daf, when it says Bito, which sounds very similar to another category, which is Bas Ishto, your wife's daughter, right? So is that the same thing? So Bas Ishto does not necessarily mean it's your daughter. It means it's your wife's daughter, which means it's your stepdaughter, which doesn't necessarily mean it's your daughter, Bas Ishto. Now, Bito is beferish, it's your daughter, but the chiddush we're going to say is Bito ma'anusaso, that it wasn't that you had this daughter through kedushin, but you were ma'anis, a woman, and that's how you were able to have this child as a daughter. That is not beferish in the psukim, it's a drasha. And when it comes to drashos, even though, of course, psukim are psukim, which are very important, but those are beferish, explicitly written. It's more chaviv for the chachamim, something which they derive from a drasha. And therefore, bito, since bito manusasus through a drasha, that's why it's mentioned first. As we continue to Gimel Amud Aleph. So Gemara says, well, 1 second. So bito comes from a drasha. Okay, and I understand that's chaviv, but kuhunami midrasha asu. It's not just bito. All the other ones as well, to pot to them from Yibum, is also the same thing. We also know this from a drasha. So in Yibum as midrasha, it's true. To pot to them from Yibum. That indeed is something that comes from a drasha when it comes to all of them, not just by bito, but ikr isaraihu behenyuksibhu. The fact that it's also to have relations with them, that is beferish, that they are considered to be an ereva. However, bito ikar isura midrasha. However, when it comes to, again, Rashi here says, once again, we're talking about bito manusaso, mastisin, that is completely from a drasha. Even the source of ereva. Diyama Rav Amrli Rav Yitzchak Bar Abdimi Asya Hena Asya Zima. We only learned out the din of Bita Manusaso through this Gzer Shava of Zima Hena. Rashi says as follows: V'hari Bito mi'ishto b'chlal bas ishto. We know what says Bito mi'ishto, your wife's, a daughter from your wife, is b'chlal bas ishto. Of a Bito Manusaso lo mishtoi. That's actually not what the pasuk is talking about. They say ervas isha, uloshin ishus. The pasuk uses the language of isha, means that you're married to her. Kedushin mashma. This girl, this daughter, came about through kedushin of sorts. The galar chaman bebas bito ubas benoma nusaso b'haikra ervas bas bincha ubas bincha v'achaloshin ishus loksiv. It doesn't mention anything about ishus, so therefore it must be talking about manusaso. So that's the drasha through the Gzer Shava of Zima, that also when it comes to Bito, the din is Bito Menusaso, that there's a punishment of Sreifa. The Hashad Yamar Kol Mil Sidias Midrasha Chavivule, anything that comes from a drasha is chaviv to the Chachamim. So listening L'achais Ishil Basof. So Achos Isha, even though we said really is the primary source of all of this in our Mishnah, because it's not a drasha, it should come at the end. But if we look at the language of the Mishnah mentions, again, Bito first, because it's a drasha, and Bas Bito, Bas Beno, the whole chiddush of Bito Manusaso. And then it mentions all other cases. And then eventually it mentions Achos Ishto. Eventually it talks about Achos Ishto. It doesn't mention it right away, Achos Isha. The question is, why not? Well, if it's something in which is a pasuk, then it shouldn't be mentioned in the middle. It should be at the very, very end, like by kalaso. It should be the last one. If it's not coming from a drasha, it should be the least mentioned. So on this, the Gemara says as follows: you're right. However, I did Ari B'Iser Achvasa. Since we're already talking about brothers, Tan Achvos Ishto. So then we already mentioned in the wife's sister. Since we're already talking about siblings, so we put that in there as well. But in Echanam, you're right. When it comes to your wife's sister, that's beferish, but we're not going to put it at the end, because while we're already talking about siblings, so we're going to continue to put that in there as well. It seems to flow better with the words of our Mishnah. So listening behind Babal Masov. So once you mention that at the end of all the sibling categories, Tana, let this whole group be mentioned at the end. Ela Tana Kurvi Nakat. Rather, a totally different shot. the Tana mentions the closest relatives and the closest relationships first, and then the ones who are less connected or not as related to you are mentioned afterwards. So now we can understand the Mishnah, not be al pidrasha, but because of who's closer in relationship. So first of all, bito, bas beno, when it comes to your daughter and granddaughters, the kruvi atzma, those are considered close, says Rashi. No other relatives are closer to them. So we mention the ones who are closer. It's almost like that we start off saying the less of the chiddush, that it's a davar pashut that it should work by them, that you're pater to do yibum, also to the tzara, and then even those who are further removed. And since it mentions three regarding on his side, so taninam shloisha doros lamata dida. Then it continues and mentions 3 doros going down on her side. Says Rashi, the Ishtov, his wife. The Avrav the Hanach la mishum kurva didei asirule. It's not because he's close to them, because those aren't really his kids. It's by virtue of the fact that he was married to someone who had brought daughters into this marriage. But nonetheless, since in contrast to his daughters and granddaughters, so we mentioned her side as well. Okay, so that's why the beginning is written in this way. And since it mentions 3 on her side, so Tana Shloisha Doros L'mala Dida. So we're going to mention the 3 generations going up on her side. Says Rashi, Lamata Dida, Lamala Dida. Chamoso, regarding his mother-in-law, Lamala, and above that, Dide Lamatzil Misni Midi. Fine. So that's the reason why it mentions going down and then it goes up. The Tana Achoso, then it mentions sister. The Acha is Imo, his mother's sister. The Kruvi Atzmo, again, they're also close. The Adi the Ari Be'isr Achva, and while we're talking about siblings, Tana Achos Ishto. That's why we mention your wife's sister. Dinhu, the truth is, Delikadma Lakalato. The truth is, we probably should have mentioned the daughter-in-law before Eishes Achiv. The Eishes Achiv Shul Hayabolomo. The case of Eishes Achiv Shul Hayabolomo, which is referring to a situation where you had, let's say, Reuven, Shimon, Levi. Reuven died. He didn't have any children, as Rashi says on the top of Beis and Beis, and then afterwards, he had a brother that was born after he died. So Reuven was married. He died without kids, but then only afterwards his brother was born. So that's considered to be he's not doesn't do yibum because he has to be ba'olam. So this is talking about Eishes Achiv Shulhai Balomo. If it's your brother's wife, Shulhai Balomo, so he is not going to be zokuk. Even if, let's say, for example, Reuven had another brother that did Yibum, let's say Shimon, and again, Levi was born later, and then Shimon dies, Nebuch. So even though Levi was alive when Shimon was alive, and then Shimon died, he still will not thereafterwards do Yibum, because the original Zika comes from the first husband, Reuven. And since Reuven had died before Levi was born, so that's what it's talking about. So that's the case of Achos Ishta of the Eishes Achiv Shulhaya Bolomo. So the truth is, Kalaso should be mentioned before that. Delo Mishum Kurva Hudi Asira. The reason why it's also is not because they're close. El Aidi de Ari Be'isr Achva Tani Eishes Achiv Shulhaya Bolomo. V'Hadar Tana Kalaso. Again, it's not because it's a close relationship. As I mentioned, this situation seems a little bit far, but nonetheless, it is an element of brothers, of siblings. Again, Reuven died before Shimon was born. So the din is, as we said, that Levi, this boy who gets married, who is born later in life, after his brother died, he never saw his brother for a second. So the din is that he doesn't do Yibum. So that's really not really close in relationship, but it doesn't matter because it's a case of brothers. So even though it's not as close necessarily as the case of kalasoi, of the case of the daughter-in-law, but because we're talking already about brothers, so we continue linking that together. Okay, so that is the explanation going through the entire order of the Mishnah, why it's written in that way. It's written in order of closeness to that individual. So now the Gemara asks a totally different question. In my area, the Tana Poitrois, Lisni Osros. So let's see this language of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says they have these 15 people, 15 women who are pater, not only them from doing Yibum, but it's also their Sorosehan, also their co-wives. So just like if, again, Reuven's daughter married Shimon, Reuven and Shimon are brothers, Shimon dies, obviously Reuven can't do Yibum or Chalitza, there's no Zika to his own daughter, he also doesn't have any Zika, he has no connection to the co-wife. She's pater. The question is, what do you mean pater? It's not just that they're pater, it means they're not allowed to. It's usher for them to do Yibum. They're not allowed to. So why does he use the language of potros? Listen, osros. So why does our Mishnah say it that way? So itana osros, if our Mishnah would have said that they're usher sahabamina asal yabim aval michlitz choltz kamashmulon, maybe you would make a mistake and think, oh, it's usher for them to do yibum because that's a marriage, but for them to do chalitza, there's nothing wrong with them doing chalitza. So the reality is they don't do chalitza either. They're pater from having to do chalitza. If he uses the strong language of chalitza of usher, you would not. It's not, as Rashi says, lo shayich loshen isur b'chalitza ela loshen patur. You don't have to do it. It's not usher to do it. You don't have to do it. So therefore, the language of poter is a way of removing oneself from having to think that there's a different din when it comes to chalitza. So where it says, okay, so the whole issue by chalitza, mostly asur lachloitz. Why can't you just use that language? So my ka'ovid. What do you do? What's going to happen? If we say, don't worry about it, you can do chalitza, what's the big deal, right? You're not doing anything anyway, right? You're not really accomplishing anything. The problem is that if we allow you to do chalitza, you may start doing yibum, right? So even though we can maybe technically say, do chalitza, it's not the biggest deal, but if we start allowing chalitza, people link chalitza to yibum. And if a person does chalitza, they'll end up doing yibum, says Rashi. The person will end up saying that you can actually do yibum. So Gemara says, you would say like this, only since it's b'makam mitzvah, when it comes to yibum, which is b'makam mitzvah, normally you're not allowed to marry your brother's wife, that's an asur, she's an ereva. It's only b'makam mitzvah, when your brother dies without children, that you're allowed to marry her. But the b'makam mitzvah hu di'asir tzara. Maybe only in that situation do we say that the Sarah is asur. Only in that situation we'll say it. Again, like for example, Sarah's Habas, that when it's asur to do yibum for the daughter. And also, of course, also for the tzara. Shalom b'makam mitzvah sharia. You would think maybe when it comes shalom b'makam mitzvah, let's say again there's no connection, so then maybe it's allowed, says Rashi. Could go nachri, shasa chanaso. Let's say you have a stranger, he's person who's married to the daughter is not your brother, right? It's some stranger. Vo isha cheres. And he has some other wife. Umeis umuteres ishto uchalmov. So in that situation, the wife is allowed to marry. So mishum hachi tani potros. So in other words, like this: in the event that a person would look at this Mishnah, they would perhaps say that b'makam mitzvah, when it comes to doing yibum, okay, that's the only time that the Sarah is asur. And it makes sense because I can't marry my daughter, so also I'm not going to be allowed to marry the Sarah. Shalom b'makam mitzvah, sharia. Let's say there is no mitzvah. Let's say the Sarah is related to, the Sarah is was married to some strange guy, and he died. So the question is, am I allowed to be with her? So this is my daughter's co-wife, but it's shalom b'makam mitzvah. Mishum hachi tani potros. That's the reason why it says the language of potter. Says Rashi, di tan osros, because if it would have said osir, then mashma shabas osarta olav likach. Then you would think that it means that your daughter, that was the daughter that asered you to take. The kavachomer shalom b'makam mitzvah, and this is shalom b'makam mitzvah. Avo potros lo mishtame isura mishum sarata shalbas. When it says potter, you're not going to say there's an isser when it comes to the tsar of your daughter. El habas potarta miyibum. Your daughter is potter from doing yibum. Obviously, the isura shachavala. Obviously, you're not allowed to be with your daughter. So from that we can deduce the havi be'isser eshes ach sheish labanim. It's under the category of your brother's wife who has children. If your brother's wife has children, then you're not allowed to take her. Umishum eshes ach hu demitzer. And we'd say that she's aser al eshes ach shalom b'makam mitzvah. The lake iser eshes ach ola sharia. But if there's no concept of eshes ach, then it would be mutter. Okay. So let's look at question 4 over here. Question 4. He asks, Chamesh esrei nashim potros, madua lo tani osros. Why does it say these 15 women are potter? Why did it say aser? So he says like this: Asuros, if they're aser, it's mashma shabaso sartalav likach the afshalo b'makam mitzvah. You would say that the daughter makes you aser to take the tzara even shal b'makam mitzvah. Lafikach tana potros the erva lo mishavia isura atzara. The fact that your daughter was married to this man and he had a co-wife, but this man is not related to Reuven. El l'dikaima b'isur eshes ach shlo b'makam mitzvah. Rather, it's under the category of the isur of eshes ach shlo b'makam mitzvah. So therefore, again, in the event that we were talking about a situation that it would say aser, then you would think that the daughter is the one who's asering the tzara, even in a situation where shalom b'makam mitzvah, where again this guy is just a stranger, he's not even related to you. So therefore, it mentions this that tell you that the din is when it comes to shalom b'makam mitzvah, sharia, and that's why it says pater. So in my area, the tani min chalitza min hayibum, listening min hayibum l'chudei. Why doesn't it just say pater from yibum? Why does it have to mention anything about chalitza? So itan min hayibum havamina michatz chalza. You would think you could do chalitza yibum miyama. Maybe you would think you don't have to do yibum. You don't do yibum, but maybe you still have to do chalitza. Kamash one. So therefore, that's the reason why the Mishnah, when it mentions Yibum, it also has to mention Chalitza. It cannot just say that they're pater min hayibum. It has to be pater from Yibum and Chalitza. You should, otherwise you maybe make a mistake and think that they're exclusive, they're mutually exclusive, or one is not totally on the other, which in fact they are. For listening min Yibum umin Chalitza. So why doesn't it say it the other way around? I just mentioned chalitza. So Abba Sholhi the Omer mitzvahs chalitza kodemus mitzvahs yibum. The reason why it mentions it in the order that it does is to tell you that according to him, it's a mitzvah to do chalitza before yibum. The question is why? Yibum comes first. So Rashi says over here, according to Abba Shol, which we'll see later on, Abba Shol Omer hakainis yivimtai. One who marries the Yevamot l'shem noi because she's beautiful, l'shem ishus ki'ilu poigeb erva. V'kar b'enai liyos havlad mamzer. So it's very, very serious that he says unless a person is marrying this woman with the greatest of intentions, so therefore because of that, better do chalitza. Says Tosus hashd diktani tervayu v'shena chalitza b'reisho mashma chalitza kodemas. it mentions chalitza first to tell you that chalitza comes first. But ilu havi tani el chalitza chuda lo havi mashmida. If it only said chalitza, you wouldn't know this drasha. So you need to have both of them and then chalitza before to teach this din. Okay, now the Gemara asks a different question. Minyana de reishel muti mai, minyana de seivli muti mai. The Mishnah starts talking about that there are 15 chamish esri nashim. Now we could count those, and we would obviously know that's how many are. And then once again in the Seifa, it once again repeats it and says there's 15. So the question is, why do we need to know this number? Again, what is the significance of what's coming to include, or rather what's it coming to exclude? Not to mention, this is the number, must be excluding others. So the Gemara says as follows. Mute as we continue Gimel Mud Beis. Mute the Rav. One's coming to exclude Rav. Udarav Asi. Rav Asi, Mute Mai. So one second, what are they coming to exclude? Says Rashi, the Amar Rav, as we'll see in this a second. Isvirlahu Dahadadi Chadal Mutate. If you want to learn them together, Chadal Mutate Saras Menas, Vachadal Mutate Saras Maxagru Shaso. Then it's possible that one is coming to exclude the tsara of miyun. Now, miyun is a situation which we saw already in the Mishnah, where a katana, or even if it's a father who's alive, who married her and then she left the marriage, so she's considered like a yasoma b'chai bala, b'chai avia, that she's still like an orphan, in that the father no longer has reshus to remarry her. So there's a din yibum, there's a din miyun. Now she could have herself get married off midrabanan through kedushi maimer with her brother or mother, and if she wants, she can leave the marriage. So there's a din of miyun, and there's also the tsoros memenas, because as we mentioned, let's look in Rashi. Diafa gav the asira leha will mifter mechalitza lahachisura midrabanan he. It's an isad rabbanan, so therefore the tsara at least has to do chalitza. It's enough if this girl who is a katana who does miyun, or this is a kedusha de rabbanan, so therefore because she's related, so therefore she's one of the erevas, but it's only midrabanan is the marriage, so therefore we're going to require her tsara to still have to do at least chalitza. Therefore it's coming to exclude her tsara that she has to do chalitza. And the chadam muti tsaras maxagru shaso. What's that? So it says Rashi, Achiv, you have a brother shigirish achas mishnei nashav. So he had two wives, and he divorced one of those wives. But nises la'acher, and he married the other. The avar v'hechziro la'acher v'hechzira, and he remarried the other one. Li'acher misas bala, after the husband died. Umeis bulo banim u'shteim asuros lisyavim. So both of them are usher to do yibum. However, we say that chalitza is still required. So even though by Maxagru Shaso he wasn't really supposed to have done this, a person is allowed to take her back in the event that another marriage didn't take place in the middle. But since there was another marriage, so she's not allowed to get remarried to him. But who's Albar V'Hachzira, he did remarry her, and because of that, when he died without children, they're usher to do yibum. Now again, you can maybe say this is not really kedushin kadas Moshe of Israel. Doesn't make any difference. We still require chalitza. Now the ilo svir hu bahadi kaos. So Rashi says like this. Top. Do you ever Rav Saras Saita Asura Rav Asi Yomer Saras Ayonas Asura? Okay. The ilo svir leho dahadadi chadol mute dechavre v'chadol mute. Once they exclude their friends, v'chadol mute otsaras mamena so saras maxir shasa. So the other ones say, if we're going to stop Rashi, according to Rav, he excludes tsaras sota. What is that? If let's say she is, says Rashi, shimzinta ishto. Let's say one's wife is accused of having znus, velo isha cheres, and this guy is married to another second wife. Umeis bulo banim. The guy dies. Shtein paturos. So according to the shita of Rav, he says that Sarasota is putter from doing yibum, because in that situation, this is a sota she's aser herself alt ereva. So too, even though maybe now she's aser labal, Ravasi omer saras ailonis asura. Shim hoya nasi ailonis. If you married a woman who couldn't have children as an ailonis, bisha cheres, a second woman umeis blobanim, obviously no, couldn't have children with her, but also the other one. Shtein paturos, and we're going to see all this later on in our parak. So these are 4 different circumstances in which it's possible our Mishnah is coming to exclude these ervas. Fine. Possibly, again, according to each shita, it's maybe one holds yes, the other holds no. But if you look at all 4 as a possibility, those are cases in which the Mishnah would be coming to exclude that there would be some element of a chiyuv of maybe at least doing chalitza. Rav Asi lisninhu. Now our Mishnah should include these cases. Again, according to Rav, he holds that Saras Sota is aser. Rav Asi holds Saras Ailis is asura. The other one, they both disagree and they hold the opposite, but at least according to their shitas, these should be mentioned. Our answer is Lefi She'enu B'Tsaras Sara, because there's no co-wife's co-wife. What does that mean? So let's look in Rashi. When it comes to Ailonis or Sota, there's no Tsaras Sara. The Chol Hanach the Masnisin Iko Misnei Halacha Sarata. We mentioned in our Mishnah the case of the co-wife, the Nises Achiv Hasheni, and she marries like a second brother. Shar'enu Ereva El Wazeh. As we said, she's only an Arab. Let's say it's Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. So what ends up happening is Reuven is the father and Sarah is the daughter. And this daughter, Sarah, marries Shimon. Shimon dies. So Levi is not an Ereva to Sarah. Right? Shar'enu Ereva El Wazeh. There's only an Ereva to Reuven, not to Levi. She could marry Levi. She can't marry Reuven. Avol Achav Hasheni Ruyas Hain. But to the other brother, again in our case, Levi, she could marry. V'im Yibim, if let's say they did Yibum, Nefil Esat Sarah, and he does Yibum, Levi marries both of them. V'lo Isha Cheres, and he also has another wife. Umeis, and then Levi dies. V'nofel Ifnei Zeh, Patura Af Hanachris, Nenishu Saras Sarah. She's a tsaras tsara, shalbito. So, even though basically what happens here is, again, Reuven's daughter Sarah ended up marrying Shimon. Shimon died. Now Levi marries through Yibum Sarah, and he has other wives. In addition to the tsar, he has a tsaras tsara, because Levi was previously married, and let's say he married Shimon's 2 wives. One was Sarah and the other one was Tzara. One was co-wife. So those 3 women, when Levi dies, Reuven does not marry the Tzara. Obviously can't marry his own daughter, but also her co-wife, but also Tzara's Tzara. So is an Isser of Tzara's Tzara. Avol B'Sota of Ailonis. However, when it comes to a Sota, and when it comes to an islandess, in both of those cases, halacha sarasa, you can't mention this case that there was this co-wife, Benises Achiv Hasheni, that married the other brother. To al kol ha'achin hi asura, because she's asur to all the brothers. V'she isur ba lo mekayach kedushi ba'al harishon v'kuin shaven behen. So when it comes to this sota, she's asur. And to this islandess, he's aser. So therefore, there's no situation of a tsaras tsara that Levi would end up marrying the sota, or Levi would marry the islandess. We wouldn't find that situation. So therefore, because of that, we say the din is, we don't mention those cases. TA 18. Madua lo katani b'mastis and saras sota v'ailonis l'mandi amr shepatura sur sehen. So on this, lefi shenim b'tsaras tsara, because again they don't have this co-wife co-wife. As we just mentioned, no need to explain it again. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to shift and just discuss how do we know this din of our Mishnah B'chlal. So Mina Hanimili. So how do we know the Tanu Rabbanan? The pasuk says, Isha al-chosa lo-sikach. A person is not allowed to take this, your sister. So this is, as we started off this daf, this is a case of achos isha, your wife's sister. So it says, Isha al-chosa lo-sikach, l'tzror, l'galois ervas oleha b'chayeha. Now the pasuk says aleha. So why does it say aleha? Yevamot. When it comes to Yibum, you're supposed to have Tashmish and marry her. Shomani afil achas mikol rayus hamuras b'Torah hakasam adaber. Maybe the fact that it says this, aleha, maybe it's coming to tell you, even though there's an Isser Rayus, maybe it'll override it because there's a mitzvah of Yibum. Maybe mitzvah of Yibum will be doiche and push off even these very strong stringencies and isurim of being with an arayah, one of your arayahs. Shnemar kan, so nemar kan, oleha v'nemar olehon oleha. Malhon b'makam mitzvah, avkan b'makam mitzvah. The only time a person is to take them is dafka if it's a makam mitzvah, to do yibum. Shalom b'makam mitzvah, not, because it's an erva. V'ramachman v'losikach. The pasuk says v'losikach. The fact that it says v'losikach is telling you that you're not allowed to take them because even if it's b'makam mitzvah. Now, all these erevas, the fact that it says losikach, it tells you that you would not think that you could marry an ereva because of yibum. So again, imagining the situation that Reuven's daughter married Shimon. Shimon died, so you say, oh, maybe you're supposed to even marry your own daughter. That's what maybe there's a havamina like that, because even though it's an Isser ereva, right? As we mentioned, is an Isser Sreifa, doesn't make any difference. Maybe it's mutter because it's b'makam mitzvah. We allow yibum. That's why the pasuk says lusikach. No, now the ainli elahi. I can understand you can't marry your daughter. So rasim tamanuim litzror. So the fact that it says litzror, so Rashi says tsaras harbi mashma. It's referring to tsaros. The ainli el tsaras tsaras rasim tamanuim litzror. So again, it's including many. So again, all we know from the pasuk, this pasuk is talking about achas isha, that you're not allowed to take your wife's sister. So if again you're married and your wife's sister married your brother, right? Which basically two sisters marrying two brothers. So your brother died. You cannot do yibum on your wife's sister. That's beferish in the pasuk, and we said maybe it should be mentioned last because it's not ladrasha. At least we had that at one point. So sharais menayin. How do we know all the other rayas? It's 15 in our Mishnah. So amrit ma'achos isha miyuchedesh hi erva. When it comes to achos isha, one of the erevas, the chayven al zedayne kares v'ashgasachatis. If you have tashmish with your wife's sister, there's an Isser kares, and B'shagig is an Isser kares. This is all mentioned in Parshas Arayos, as Rashi quotes. The Asur Yavam, as the pasuk says, it says Lusikach. So Avkol Shehir Erba V'chayven Ol Zedel Kares V'Ashgasachatas Asur Yavam. Mainly Ella Hain. I only know again those erevas. Sarasei and Menayin. How do we know that also those, like your daughter's erevas, also Tsaras also? So Amrit Ma'achos Isha Miyuchedesh She Ereva. She's an ereva. V'chayev Ol Zedel Kares V'Ashgasachatas V'Asur Yavam. You can't do yibam not only to her but also V'Sarasa Asura, also to the Saras also Asur. Avkoil She Ereva V'chayev Ol Zedel Kares V'Ashgasachatas. All the other erevas the same. V'Asur Yavam. It's also to do yibum with your ereva. Tsarasa asura, and also the tsar is asur. Mekan amru, and from here we derive from the chachamim chamish esrei nashim potros soroseim v'sar soroseim menachalitzim and yibum ad sov ha'olam, that all of them are asur to do yibum with forever. All connections. Yachol shani marba av sheish arayos chamuros. You would maybe think to even include the 6 arayos chamuros me'elu shahayos soroseim asuros. that when it comes to these 6, let's see, Rashi, what is that referring to? Shenasuos lacherim, that they were married to others, shahayu sorasem asuros linasi lezeh, that their tsaros are usher to marry them, right? Which are basically strangers. So on this, so amrit ma achos ishim yuchedesh erva. It's only if it's an erva. The chayav and elzeh then occurs hashgas achatas. The efshel hinasi la'achem, and could marry brothers. In other words, 2 brothers could marry 2 sisters. So Eishes Ach, the case of Eisha of Achos Isha rather, is allowed. 2 brothers are allowed to marry 2 sisters. So the marriage is Chal. Vasur Yavam. However, if the brother would die, you can't do Yibam on her. The Tsarasa Surah Avkol Shehi Erva V'chayim Nolas the Chatas the actually Nase La'achem, and it's possible to marry one another. 2 brothers, 2 sisters. Vasura liyavam, sarasa asura. Yatsu sheish arayos chamuros, excluding the 6 arayos chamuros, me'elu, hoyel di'i actually nasila achim, since they cannot marry into the brothers, sarasem mutaros. So their saras are no mutter. Shein sara el ach, because the whole din of sara, dafka comes from the brother. Question 6. B'man nishtanu sheish arayos hachamuros mechamish esrei hamenuyim b'mishnah lafikach sarasem mutaros. Why do we make a difference between the 6 and the other 15? So he says like this: Chamiri she'enin yecholin li'nasil achav mi'aviv. The other 6 are strict in that you cannot marry your from your father's side the brother. The in sara neseres el ma'ach. The only reason why that Sarah is usher is from the brother. And therefore, if it doesn't fall into that category, so then there's no din, there's no din isser. Azhar shemata nishmanayin. Al-mukra kikol isha sher yas mikol hatawevois. So we have the pasuk. So now we're going to conclude with the following question, which we'll review on tomorrow's daf. Taima de kasav rachaman aleha. The only reason why we said all of this is because the pasuk says oleha, ho lav hachi. If let's say it didn't say the word oleha in the pasuk, which we said shameani afilu b'achas mikol ras hamus b'tayra kasam adaber. So havamina achos isha miyavamo. You would think that you could actually do yibum with your achos isha. The fact that it says this drush of oleha, so it's coming to tell you that no, you're not allowed to. And you have this Gzer Shava, Nemerkan Aleha, Nemer Holan Aleha. The fact that it says Aleha tells you that's Dafka, it's Mitzvah's Yibum. But if it's B'makam Ereva, no, then it's not allowed. So, which is mashma, if there was no pasuk of Aleha, you would think that you could do Yibum with these women, like with your own daughter. Achos Isha Mayavma, my taima. What's the reason? Diamrin Asiyas say, V'dachilos asay. You could maybe say, okay, well, there's a mitzvah saseh to do yibum. And since a mitzvah saseh of yibum, so it can push off a lo saseh of, again, not having relations with these Erevos. The Be'emer Damrin and asay, asi asay v'dachilos asay, lo saseh greda. Maybe an asay can push off a lo saseh if all you're dealing with is a lo saseh. However, lo saseh sheish bokaris midachi. Over here, we're talking about a situation where there's a din kares. Of all these arayos, there's an isser kares, as we said. So how is it zedona kares, as we mentioned? So why would we think, even have a havamina, to think that an asay could push off a losaseh b'makom kares? That's question number 1, which we're going to spend a lot of time talking about. Furthermore, losaseh greda minon dedachi. How do we know just in general there's a concept of asay, there's doichelos asay? On this, we're going to see the answers to these questions tomorrow in the subsequent daf at Matkan.